How do you introduce a man that needs no introduction, right? Plus we have people here who have stories on him. I think that might be a more interesting story.
Well, I'm not coming back for when Ken
But he is a member of that group, and he's a great speaker, and he's going to do another great presentation tonight on the First Presbyterian Church, Steve Bowers.
All right. Thank you. We're going to do some what you call rudimentary sound work tonight. We're going to try to play this through the speaker of the computer, put it on the microphone, see if that'll be loud enough. I'm going to begin with a 7-minute video that was produced by TRTV in the mid-1980s. And they did one on the Mother Liberty CME Church, did one on the Presbyterian Church. Well, it was done around Clarence Pickford and his life. Of course, it became instrumental in the history of the Presbyterian Church. So it's about 7 minutes, and we'll pick it up. When you talk about doing history, it's always difficult. But like in genealogy, you're certainly dealing with facts, marriage, birth dates, whatever. But then filling in the blanks of those lives. Was it a happy marriage? Was it, what was the family like? That's when you get into history and in many cases interpretation. Bill Moyers talked about being from Texas, ran into a man well into his career with the shows that were on PBS. Found out they were raised in the same town in Texas, same time. This man was African American. And when they started comparing notes, there were no similarity. The people they referred to, the influences that they remembered, the places that they hung out, socialized, all this stuff were totally different. Same city, totally different perspective. We're under a lot of pressure now that people are saying, well, we need to teach real history, we need to teach true history. And those of y'all that are historians and that delve into it know that that's the ultimate challenge. So how do you tell the history of a church, or talk about the history of a church? Well, there are many ways to do this. Catherine Carls has done an excellent book. She did it in conjunction with the Bicentennial Church last year. It's Sharing Worship and Caring, First Presbyterian Church, Jackson, Tennessee. She makes every effort, because Harvard-Alexander did a lot of fundamental work. Emma Williams makes reference to the Presbyterian Church in her history. And Catherine has everything from notes and observations from different women in the church, history of some of the women's organizations, as well as the pastors and the buildings and everything else. It's a great overview, so if you're interested in that, I would highly recommend it. Well, let's begin, if we can, if this will work, see if we can get it loud enough, with this profile of Clarence Pickford of Jackson, Tennessee. Can y'all hear that at all? This show is called As Times Go By, or Times Gone By. The narrator of the show is Frank Couples.
Clarence Pickford was born in Lauderdale County, Mississippi in 1873. He was the grandson of Mississippi pioneer settlers, and the family was of Scotch-Irish origin. At the age of 15, he moved to Jackson and later enrolled as a student at Southwestern Baptist University, which later became Union University. From the beginning, Mr. Pickford's ambition was to become a lawyer, but he was from a large family, and their financial condition was such that he declined any assistance from his father in preparing himself to practice law. So after graduation from college, he took a job in the office of a lumber company in order to raise the money he needed to attend law school. By September 1895, he was able to enter Cumberland University, where he graduated in 1896 as a Bachelor of Laws. He immediately began his law career as a member of the firm of White and Pickford. Later, he joined E.S. Mallory when they formed a partnership with Mallory and Pickford. Their law offices were in this building, which is still in use on Baltimore Street today. also had a group of citizens which built the 8-story building now occupied by the First American National Bank. The original bank there was People's Savings Bank. Built in 1924, it was the first modern office building in Jackson. At its completion, Pickford and Key moved their law offices to the 8th floor of the new bank building. In 1936, Clarence E. Pickford was among 8 men who were involved in a very important building project for Madison County. The present Madison County Courthouse was completed under the supervision of a building committee, of which Mr. Pickford was a member. Other buildings in the city came into being due partially at least to the efforts of Clarence Pickford. He was on the building committee that constructed the post office building. He was deeply interested in the YMCA in Jackson and helped to raise the funds needed to retire their bonded debt. He also served on the building committee which was in charge of erecting the YMCA building, which remained in existence till the early 1960s. Mr. Pickford is a dedicated member of the First Presbyterian Church and was instrumental in the significant building programs carried out there during his lifetime. One of his favorite projects in connection with First Presbyterian Church was the installation of the Caroline. It was built as a memorial to Madison County men who had given their lives in World Wars I and II. Mostly through Clarence Pickford's efforts, the fund for this project reached $25,000. Sadly, he died before the project was completed. 5 years after his death, the memorial chimes were dedicated in a ceremony on the church grounds. Between 7,500 and 10,000 spectators thronged the broad acres surrounding the church to witness the dedication. A mile-long line of latecomers jammed the main highway and taxed the efforts of police and highway patrol officers to handle the unprecedented crowd. The Caroline is housed in a magnificent tower which adjoins the First Presbyterian Church and consists of 47 bells. It was constructed under the guidance of Dr. Arthur Bigelow, bellmaster of Princeton University, as well as laureate of the Caroline School of Macon, Belgium. The chimes were cast and tuned in Savoie, France. The bell towers and bells have been identified by several great caroling heroes as comprising the most perfect instrument of its kind in the world. Jackson's civic affairs and Tennessee's history were always matters of deep personal interest to Clarence Pickford. This interest led him to organize the Madison County Historical Society. The Society's first goal was to publish a history of Madison County in book form. Historic Madison by Emma N. Williams was published in 1946, the year of Tennessee's sesquicentennial. Mr. Pickford died in 1945 and didn't live to see the publication of this notable work. The book is dedicated to those citizens of Madison County who have made this history possible, and Clarence E. Pickford and W.A. Caldwell, who organized the Madison County Historical Society for the publishing of this volume. In November of 1907, Clarence Pickford married Sally Bransford Person, a native of Jackson. In 1915, they built Chevy Chase, one of the most beautiful homes ever constructed in the history of Jackson. Its magnificent architecture is evident even from the long vantage point that most of us have as we pass by it on Highland Avenue. Up close, it is even more remarkable. For over 70 years now, these lions have stood guard to the entrance to the mansion. Clarence Pickford's college fraternity was Sigma Alpha Epsilon, whose mascot is the lion. Through the years, this spot has been a favorite spot for photographs for the SAE fraternity at Union University. It was the Pickfords who provided the land for the construction of the First Presbyterian Church next door to home. In this early photograph, you can see it was a garden spot on the lawn where the church now stands. Mrs. Pickford was well known for her many charities, general and individual, and was an exceptionally active and prominent figure in the business, civic, cultural, and social life of Jackson. Mrs. Pickford, in her later years, gave Chevy Chase to the First Presbyterian Church, and upon its grounds stand Memorial Caroline, as well as an education building. The house itself was renamed Memorial Hall and is used today as a fellowship center, Sunday school classes, and for the church offices. If you've never been in this home, you still might recognize this beautiful staircase. For years, it has provided a scenic backdrop and photographs of many a Jackson bride. Clarence and Sally Pickford never had children, but the legacies they left behind are phenomenal and still live on. Even though Mr. Pickford didn't live to see several of his notable school projects finished, the dreams that he had inspired others to work hard in order to make those dreams become reality. While much of the world was engulfed in the flames of World War II, Clarence Pickford died peacefully on January 8, 1945, in the town he loved so much. He earned the respect, admiration, and confidence of its citizens from all walks of life. His public spirit and influence can still be seen in many places today about the city. Jackson, Tennessee was very fortunate indeed to have a man like Clarence E. Pickford in times gone by.
That was, once again, a TRTV production in the mid-80s, I think. Because they said, well, the lines have been there 70 years, they've been there over 100 now, so. And wanted to share that, to give you some perspective. We've got people here, I know that, I guess, we have people here who are married in the church downtown, so people that knew Clarence Pickford.
Miss Pickford is the one you like. My favorite servant, Miss Pickford, she was tall, and we used to watch her. She liked to sing, and when she hit the high note, she would go up on her tiptoes. And we loved it, because we loved Miss Pickford, and that's what we remembered about her. And it's Mrs. Pickford's house, it's not Memorial Hall for me.
Okay. Well, like I said, talking about the history of a church, one of the things about the Presbyterian Church is, even when Jackson was frontier town, some of the prominent people here were members of that church. And so it's always had a tie to what was going on socially in the city and in issues. Sometimes churches are focused in their work on, spiritual matters and saving people and other things. The Presbyterian Church has always been kind of an interesting mix of all of that. So what I want to do is to take a look at, first of all, some of the buildings in the history of the church, the pastors that were involved in there as they transitioned, and then some of the pastors that were involved in key transition points in the life of the church apart from that, to give kind of an overview. The church was, of course, this is how it stands now. And this is a sketch of the original church that was constructed. Well, it was constructed actually in 1834. Pastor was called in 1832. When Jackson was formed, there were Presbyterians here in 1823, and it's been researched. Harvard Alexander did a lot of research into this, and in a sense, it goes back to a Presbyterian meeting in Bethel Springs, September 25th through 29th in 1823. And the minutes from September 26th noted the organization of 17 Presbyterian churches to be served by 2 ministers. Jackson was one of those. And then there was another note in 1824 that Reverend John Gillespie came to the Male Academy, which is one of the first schools here, as y'all know, in Jackson, Tennessee, to establish the First Presbyterian Church. So there was recognition of the church in Jackson that had no building, had no pastor, and whatever. So it was Presbyterian, as all the other faiths, of people that reflected the faith of people that had moved here. And so Methodists and others that came in here, they started to organize, met at the courthouse, whatever. But it's kind of a loose, series of meetings, sometimes shared meeting facilities, whatever, in the early days of the faiths in this community. So the Presbyterian had a survey done in 1824 to kind of check the status of the churches to see what was going on. But it was not until 1832. Well, it's noted anyway. I'll flip it and hide it. The Presbyterian Church had its first pastor in 1832, and he was a distinguished man. It was Dr. Alexander Augustus Campbell. Back when names were names, right? He was Jackson's first local pastor. He would serve the church until 1846, and this was the church that was built. This is a sketch of that church that was built and completed. They started making plans in 1832, and they built this building and completed by 1834. Dr. Campbell was not a believer in his early life, in his early education, but he became seriously ill. And in his illness, he became reflective and promised God that if he would deliver him, that he would dedicate his life to his service. And that's what happened. He survived his illness and then committed himself to dedication to God, moved to Alabama in 1817 to practice medicine, and also to continue his theological study. He was ordained to the presbytery of North Alabama in 1822, the year Jackson was formed. And in 1823, he was also ordained in the presbytery of West Tennessee, so he was one of the first to be ordained. He had a home in Florence, Alabama, so he traveled between those two presbyteries, settled finally in Haywood County in 1830, and then came to Jackson in 1832 to dedicate himself to the work of the church in Jackson, Tennessee. They built this building and completed in 1834, got their first organ in 1845, and he died in 1846. The remodeling of this building came in 1881 under the pastorate of a man named Reverend Jerry Witherspoon, who was from Mississippi, Aberdeen, Mississippi, graduated from the University of Mississippi in 1872 after the Civil War, and attended seminary in Columbia, South Carolina. And so, well, I'm sorry, that was the wrong day. Go back. But yeah, no, it's right. 1872, and he attended Columbia Cemetery in South Carolina. He was called to Jackson in 1879 and served 4 years until 1883, where he would go on to become pastor of First Presbyterian in Nashville and the First Church in Baltimore. He went on to become a part of the board of directors of Princeton University, and he died in 1909 while pastoring at Grace Church in Baltimore. But he presided over the remodeling of this church in 1881. And this is one of the photos of that church after it was remodeled there at Main and Church Street. By the way, Dr. Campbell was the one, after he got into Haywood County and got into Jackson, he was the one that bought the property at Main and Church Street and gave it to be a church, a Presbyterian church. And so you know who's the main church in town if they're at the corner of Main and Church Street. Right? Can't be anybody else. There are other people down the street on Church Street. There are other people next door, Cypress Price and others moving next door. But who was at the corner of Main and Church? It was the Presbyterians. And that was because of his gift. And so this building stood at Main Street. The building expansion extended all the way to Main Street, and that's the building that you see today. That building continued in service at the church until its transition to the next building. And of course, they started this in 1912. We completed in 1915. But that was the church building that many of you know, were married in and whatever. And this was a huge, huge step. The expansion extended the church to Main Street, and it transitioned under Reverend Albert Sidney Johnson, not Johnston like the Confederate general killed at Shiloh. Reverend Johnson was born in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, graduated from Union Theological Seminary in Richmond, was ordained in 1906. He served as what they called a supply pastor, like we had in the early days here. In the early days, Jackson was considered a preaching point. There wasn't a church building, wasn't a pastor, so it was a preaching point where preachers would stop off and preach until 1832 with Dr. Campbell. And so with Reverend Albert Sidney Johnson, the church expanded to this facility. He served here from 1909 to 1916, and this building work was started in 1912. He was an active minister in the sense that they had a covenanters class for boys ages 12 to 14. There were 2 Presbyterian ministers that would emerge from that class. He organized a home missionary society in 1909, believing in church outreach. The first outreach mission, you think about home outreach and mission work, you think about what? Going overseas or whatever. First mission project was at the corner of Hatton and Neely Streets in this city. And that was the Neely Street Mission. And the church bought the Neely Street Mission and converted it into a church at the corner of Hatton and Neely. We all consider that downtown now. The church became Johnson Memorial Church that was named in his honor. But the landmark work that he did was in building this, leadership, the building of this building. It was built with limestone. You see the Corinthian column architecture. It had stained glass windows because the church that we just showed you, they didn't have stained glass. The Presbyterian women took colored paper and put it over the glass to give the effect of color inside the sanctuary. Well, Presbyterians were prospering by 1912 because they actually had stained glass windows and Corinthian columns and a limestone church. And that was all under Dr. Johnson's work. They actually dedicated this church on December 5th of 1915. Building programs, if you're building on the same lot, become terribly disruptive for a church because you have to tear down the old one. When they took the organ out, they gave it to the Neely Street Mission and then got a new organ for the new church. And so the church met in the courthouse. So you can imagine if you go from 1912 to 1915 meeting in the courthouse, and It's a long time to not have a home in the sense that we have homes. The other interesting thing was it was the first time that the church took on loans. And they also made memorial dedications in exchange for cash recipients. And so they started honoring people with things. So this thing, glass window, this pew belongs to, or is bought by, or purchased by, whatever. That was the new step of the church. In 1916, Reverend Johnson left Jackson to pastor at South Highland Church in Birmingham, Alabama. There was another key event in the history of the church in 1912, and that was the formation of two presbyteries in West Tennessee. Jackson had been assigned to the Western District, and that merged with the Presbytery of Memphis. And so it became the Presbytery of Memphis, which included some of the old churches from West Tennessee, such as Jackson. The churches in Northwest Tennessee tended to become part of the Presbytery of West Tennessee. And those would hold until reorganizations and stuff came later. The transition to the church as it is known today, of course, and this became a postcard to the Jackson, to identify Jackson, Tennessee, the First Presbyterian Church building. There, or some of you may have those postcards. Stately building, I don't remember this building, I get to West Tennessee was 68. The transition came, of course, with the Pickford estate. The irony is that this home was built in 1915. That was the year that they dedicated the new Presbyterian Church downtown. Same year. And this house is going to be the one that will lead to the transition of the church from downtown to Trenton Highway, or Trenton Road, as they call it then. The home of Clarence and Sally Pickford, built in the same year as we talked about as the dedication of the new church downtown. World War I and the U.S. decision to enter World War II in 1941 accelerated plans that Clarence Pickford had for a memorial Caroline to honor those who had served and died in those wars. The ones that had died in World War I and those that he knew would die in World War II. And the original plans were for the Caroline to be part of the Presbyterian Church downtown. They also wanted to make some church expansions downtown. But because of the confinement of the lot, the structure that was going to be necessary to sustain this Caroline, as you saw with all those massive bells, it led to talk of maybe finding a new home for the church. And you know that that's a controversial decision when you're going to leave a church home. And in 1951, Sally Pickford, Mr. Pickford died in 1945. 1951, Sally Pickford offered the home and 9.5 acres to the church for construction of a new sanctuary in Caroline. So on February the 14th of 1952, the church gathered for a vote on whether to accept that offer or to remain downtown. It was going to mean they were going to move to the Trenton Road and Trenton Highway. You remember back at that time, hospital had gone out there, what, in 52? There's still a wide open area. It's north of Hicksville. A lot of people say, well, that's not in Jackson. The church gathered for a vote whether to accept the offer, and 167 voted to move north to the Trenton Road or the Trenton Highway. 108 voted against, and some of those people left that congregation after that vote because it was a disruptive process that was going to continue through 1957. It was going to take from 52 to 57 to move to the Pickford estate.
I will say this, my father voted to stay downtown, I voted to move. I do remember when he said it was very controversial in the church, it was a major event.
Major event. And your wedding was at the church downtown?
Yeah.
Okay. The Chevy Chase estate was named Chevy Chase because that's where she attended school, college at Chevy Chase, Maryland. So it was an impressive place. And you can imagine during that day and time, going through these, going through this entrance to this home, to these grounds. The construction program of the church is noted in the plaque that's in the historic room of the church. And you'll see names there from Alexander to No to Bayer that you'll recognize if you follow the history of Jackson, Tennessee. And that 5-year process was a challenging one, but it produced this. The minister that was there during this was Dr. Samuel Stanworth. He served First Presbyterian from 1927 to 1953. He's the longest serving pastor in the history of the church. So he helped guide the church all the way starting in the 1920s through the Depression, financial setbacks through World War II, the Korean War, and the early transition steps that led to this facility that First Presbyterian built and maintains today. So I don't know how many discussions Dr. Stanworth had with people during his lifetime, but he had plenty, I would think, because of social discord and all that was going on in the world with everything from the roaring 20s to the Depression to the war, deaths of young men that were part of this. 10% of Presbyterian men served in the war, which is kind of an interesting thing as well. They kept records of all that. This Caroline was dedicated September the 12th in 1954. Emmett Guy, the mayor, and thousands from across West Tennessee, Frank Douglas attended this. Dr. Norman Gibbs served as pastor then from 1953 to 56, so he was there after Dr. Stanworth retired. He served as pastor until 1956, and then and presided over that. The church had its first meeting in the sanctuary in 1957. And the transition they met in the fellowship hall and all that, they met in fellowship hall and all that, and so they could transition in 1957. But their first services were there April the 21st, and they dedicated the sanctuary in May 26th of 1957. Now, according to Catherine Carls, and Miss Birmingham may disagree with this, the last wedding in the downtown church, she said, was John V. and Susan Anderson. I don't know, 1955.
I was told one time it was me, but it was Susan.
Okay.
Susan's mother taught me Sunday school at First Presbyterian Church.
And then the first baptism in the fellowship hall with the baptismal font was Bill Hymers. So you may know Bill, of course, know his father, who was the Attorney General here. The baptismal font that was given when they were building the new building that started depending on gifts, that baptismal font is still in use as a church today. So our son was baptized through the waters of that font, and that produced the logo to where it is today. So those are the buildings. The arboretum that is there now is, of course, kind of a reflection of the flower garden, all that Frank Hubble's mentioned, this picture on the left, and then the arboretum is a beautiful accent and all for the church. We were in a session meeting one night. One of the elders said, "You can't see our church building from Highland Avenue. We have one of the most beautiful facilities in the city. You can't see it. We need to get rid of some of these trees." You can imagine how well that went over with the arboretum folks. So I told Pastor John after the session meeting, I said, "Well, you thought you were a church with an arboretum. You found out you were an arboretum with a church." Because the trees apparently are going to stay no matter what happens with anything else. This is all a part of the grounds there today. There's a real sense of history when you're First Presbyterian. This historic placard, the ones on the right out front, describe the history of the church. A tribute to those of this church who left this country, answered this country's call to serve in World War II. And that's a plaque that's still in the historic room at the church. It's on the left. And placards all over the place. The Caroline was rededicated in 2009 by a gift from Bruce Eaton III and the Eaton family in honor of their parents. And that plaque is displayed at the Caroline. It was rededicated. And there's a plaque honoring Reverend Stanworth, who was the longest serving minister of the church. The stained glass that you saw there in the video, and that's the sanctuary of the church if you haven't been, First Presbyterian.
Steve, many of the people here probably know Stan Harris, the attorney.
Right.
And of course, Dr. Stan was his grandfather.
Grandfather. And so at that time. And of course, the church celebrates 200th anniversary. Now that's a look at the building and some of the ministers that were there during the time. The other thing that affects churches are the historic circumstances that are around them. When you look at the Denmark Presbyterian Church, you realize that through much of the 1800s, that was the largest church in the presbytery. When they finally got enough members to, yes ma'am?
That's my church. And my great-great-great-grandparents went to church there. So we went from there to downtown and we moved into Jackson.
When you look at the history of Jackson, of course, Jackson is such a dominant presence in Madison County now. In the early days, of course, there were thriving communities all over the place, and there were colleges and schools and everything else in all these different communities. In Denmark, this was the largest Presbyterian church in the Presbytery of West Tennessee. And so it's a reminder that while Denmark would have 90 members, Jackson might have 40 or 50 in the earliest days of this. And so it's a reflection of how life changes. And when you look at the frontier and everything else, you know, that Jackson in 1823 is a frontier community. I mean, it's clearing land, it's doing all those things starting from scratch. And so you don't have the social order. Like I said, there were Presbyterians, but it wasn't a Presbyterian church until 1832, because it took time to put all that stuff together. And so what happens is, as time flows, it affects everything that's going on in life. If you're out here battling, well, what was it? One of the Methodist ministers said they had to battle the weather, the devil, and the Scottish Presbyterian.
And probably not in that order.
Because Scottish Presbyterians at their fundamental core were Calvinists, and you know, Methodists were much more revival, whatever. And we'll get into a little bit of that later, but it was a different thing.
My family was Scottish Presbyterian.
The churches,
I'm just like the history book.
churches are not immune to the social forces of things that go on around them. They may think they are. You know, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. It may be, but we're not. We're not. And so that becomes the challenge. It can be war, it can be weather, it can be the economy, it can be financial panics. It can be changes in the way people make a living, changes in transportation, communication, lifestyles, civil rights to suffrages. Churches are affected by what's happening around them, and that's what happened with the Presbyterian Church. Let's talk about war for a moment. Battle of Shiloh occurs April of 1862, and in June of 1862, federal troops occupied Jackson, Tennessee. They're going to remain here for a year. The pastor of the First Presbyterian Church in Jackson, starting in 1859, was Reverend Edward C. Trimble. He was born in Kentucky. In 1830, he was ordained. In 1856, he was called to Jackson in 1859. He's 29 years of age, and the whole world around him is about to fall apart. 1860, a session meeting noted that the sale of church pews was nearly completed. There were only 6 free pews. You know, you buy your pew in 1860, buy your place in the church. Church is open to you, yeah, if you've got money. If you're not, you can sit in one of the free pews, right? But either get some money or don't come back. Not literally. But you know, the people that were members of the church were people that were capable of sustaining that church. If you're not capable of sustaining that church, then you really don't have a place. It's why we have the Salvation Army. They're Wesleyan, right? But they have no place to treat people. They have no place in the church. Can't be in the church. Can't afford to be in the church. Church can't afford to have them because they take up space. So we become God's army on the street. And to this day, no sacraments or whatever in the Salvation Army, right? Because we're a street church. We're the army of God. We're not a church. You know, it's a whole different deal. But back to the point of what was going on here. The Presbyterian Church in the United States of America, which had formed in the early days of our country in 1789, was racked, Catherine Carl said, it was racked by disagreements about the Westminster Confession, Calvinistic and all this other stuff, and abolition. The Presbyterians were arguing about this long before the outbreak of the war. The Presbyterian General Assembly in May of 1861 called on the Presbyterians in this country to support the federal government and the United States of America as a religious duty. May of 1861. All right? That if you're a Presbyterian, you should support the United States of America as a religious duty. Well, Lincoln called up troops. It called up troops in April. Tennessee was about to secede from the Union, had voted against it. First time it was going to secede from the Union in June of 1861. So you can imagine that the edict from the Presbyterian General Assembly went over like a lead balloon in Jackson, Tennessee. And so the church voted to leave Presbyterian Church USA and become part of the Presbyterian Church of the Confederacy. It would later become Presbyterian Church US after the war. Okay. So it forced a split. Union troops will take over Jackson in June of 1862. And Reverend Trimble had come here in 59. The last session meeting of the church for a couple of years, when in April of 1862, right before the Union troops got here. Reverend Trimble was relieved of his duties as a church. Okay? But in 1863, the Cartmel Diaries note, Robert Cartmel's diary says in March 5th of 1863, then Mary Jane and myself walked to preaching this morning. We walked to preaching this morning. Mr. Trimble, Presbyterian preacher, preached to a house filled with Federals. So the Federals had taken over the Presbyterian Church. He preached to Federals and whatever local people were there. The church session did not meet from April 1862, right during Shiloh, until the end of 1864. When the session eventually reconvened in 1865, they called Reverend R.S. Neely. Reverend Trimble left a month after the Yankee troops left here. And he went to Indiana. And said it was for his wife's health. But the whole world shifted. If you're a Confederate, got a Confederate flag flying on top of the courthouse. Yankee troops get here in June of 1862. 1862 to 1863, stars and stripes above the courthouse. Then they leave. Then it's wide open. And it's the Fielding Hearst raids and everything else. Well, the churches are caught right in the middle of all this. So the transition came in 1865. The church called Reverend R.S. Neely to the church. He served until December of 1865, stayed there 1 year. He apparently, though, had been serving the church unofficially since 1863. So after Reverend Trimble left, he began apparently speaking at whatever services they had, whatever was going on, and then filled in for that year from 1863 to the end of 1863. The session met in December of 1865, after the war has ended, to call Dr. Evander McNair. And Reverend McNair served until 1879 as Jackson and the South and the nation worked through Reconstruction. And so it's just a reminder that war is a disruptive thing. And, Jackson would be influenced by a lot of other things. Just some quick notes. When the railroads came, how much did that change? Everything, right? It is on the rail yard, Jackson benefited from most. This is a combination of both. See a wagon in the background, you got a railroad bridge, and of course that's the one that used to jam everything up on Highland Avenue. That was Market Street in those days. That's just a reminder of that clash of progress and then still rural. Reminded of in those maps. When you look at these old maps of Jackson, you see West Alley on the right, or no, West Alley is on the left, and the alley on the right. The big wide streets are right around the Court Square, all the way up through Lafayette College, all the way down to Chester. But then when you get to West Alley, where the barbecue place is now, how thin the road is. And of course, the other alley, the market was right there where the Baptist church, where the bus depot and all that stuff is now, that narrow lane. That was the original plat of downtown. And the Presbyterian Church, where was it? Right in the middle. Main and Church Street. Of course, these are stylized, and of course, the Methodist Church was 1 block away. But this is Reverend McNair. Reverend McNair came to this church in 1866. He was a native of North Carolina. He was pastor in Louisiana. And with the war, he became chaplain of the 24th North Carolina Infantry, the Stonewall Jackson Division. So the church enters the war with a pastor who has Union sympathies and will move up north. Comes out of the war with a man who had been chaplain in the North Carolina 24th Infantry, Stonewall Jackson Division. And he will stay here till 1879. It's a horrible time of transition for everybody. The Presbyterian Church of the Confederate States of America renamed itself the Presbyterian Church in the United States. And it did not rejoin the Presbyterian Church USA for 110 years before it finally became Presbyterian Church USA. Church membership by the end of the war was down to 93. Reverend McNair sought to build membership in the aftermath and the destruction of the war, tried to restore moral authority. During his pastorate, a member was charged with intemperance, gambling, and dishonest dealing, and had to account to the church for that. If he didn't repent, you go elsewhere. It reminds me of all the stuff that was done on the frontier. When stealing chickens and selling a mare that wasn't any good was a crime, right? It was a crime. You've had to know about that just recently, right? You go to prison for 3 years for stealing chickens.
3 years for stealing chickens.
Pretty serious stuff. And but while Reverend McNair was here, of course, re-education or education became important. And the church established a Presbyterian high school on East Baltimore. Yellow fever would hit in 1878. Dr. McNair would leave here in 1879. Dr. Jerry Witherspoon, the man who had remodeled the building and all the stuff that we talked about earlier, became the pastor of the church. And that's his photo here. He was the one that, when they did the remodeling in 1881 that we talked about, had the outreach to the Neely station. And that's the reverend that did that, Jerry Witherspoon. The mainmost man right here, as far as the history of the Presbyterian Church is concerned, as far as his social activism, was Dr. Mark Matthews. And Matthews served from 1896 to 1902. He was conservative in many ways in theology, but he bought into the fact that there was a social gospel and a social mission to the church. And so being a member of the church meant that you were evangelical in your faith, but you were humanitarian in outreach in your social life and work. And he was a driving force here. His family lived in Calhoun, Georgia. Their business had been destroyed by the forces under William T. Sherman, and he was 6 feet 5 inches tall. That day, a very unusual man. He was 29 when he came to Jackson. He was organized. When he got here, he immediately produced a procedural manual that outlined the 35 groups and the opportunities you have if you became a Presbyterian to serve in this community. And so he was aggressive. His priorities were education, health, supporting women, children, and workers. The First Presbyterian Church in Jackson's Presbyterian Church, it was still then, became a public benefit religious corporation. If I go over that again, the church became a public benefit religious corporation and incorporated with the state of Tennessee as the First Presbyterian Church of Jackson. And that's where the name came from, instead of Jackson Presbyterian Church. He incorporated the church as a social outreach agency. He believed in personal purity and piety and godliness, but he believed in reaching out. Jackson, Tennessee, of course, had the boiler works, railroads, it was a commercial industrial center, increasingly surrounded by increasingly rural farmland and communities. Denmark and all these others, of course, were fading away in those days. In the late 1890s and 1900s, Jackson became a center point of what was going on here. Dr. Matthews initiated a Presbyterian night school for working adults. Established in the fall of 1897, they would train over the next 4 years 650 students. Had 35 different faculty members during that time. The Public Library Initiative, which would lead to the Carnegie Library, he personally solicited the money from Andrew Carnegie to open the library that opened here in 1903. They established a Presbyterian hospital in 1897. He intended for that hospital to continue to be supported and sponsored by the church. It got beyond the capability of the church. Their board was led by Mrs. I.D. Tyker of that Presbyterian hospital in 1897. He started a ladies' Bible training school, initiated efforts to try to limit cocaine and morphine abuse because they were readily available in those days. Start trying to warn people about that. They had winter food programs for those that were struggling with food in the winter, and they included African Americans in the distribution, which is a whole new thing here. He formed a humane society for the protection of animals and children. Humane Society for the protection of animals and children, because he saw abuse. Established another branch of the YMCA, encouraged the purchase of land by the community that produced the Bemis Mill, by the county that produced the Bemis Mill. He encouraged supporting donations from railroads and companies to support these initiatives, and there was dynamic church growth. 600 people became part of the Presbyterian Church during his pastorate. While he was here, he also passed the Tennessee bar exam. I don't know when he had time to do all that. But he left Jackson for a pastorate in Seattle, Washington, and was a phenomenal leader of this church. He was followed by Angus McDonald, who continued a lot of that work and the momentum that was there. And then, of course, then turned it over to Dr. Albert Sidney Johnson, whose work we talked about in building the new building in 1912. To be followed, of course, eventually by Dr. Samuel Stanford. There's Reverend Stanford, and the grandfather of Stan Harris. I'll put this back up for this reading. Churches obviously are influenced by what's going on around them. It dictates what's happening in the lives of the membership, the opportunities to serve with the membership. Churches are also affected by the theological issues that they deal with in their membership, but they will vary by faith. But with social engineering, you know, in the 1880s, 90s, whatever, there's a tremendous feeling of progress. Communications changing. We've gone from telegraph. We're going to we got telephones. We got railroads. We got all this, the tremendous optimism. And the fact that man can lift himself with the social engineering and everything else that was going on, there was a reaction to that. The Presbyterian General Assembly in Presbyterian General Assembly met in 1910, and it was the Presbyterians who affirmed the 5 fundamentals of fundamentalism. 1910. The divine inspiration and inerrancy of Scripture, the virgin birth of Christ, the atoning death from sin by Christ, the bodily resurrection of Jesus, and the reality of Jesus' miracles. That was affirmed by the Presbyterian General Assembly in 1910. By 1967, there was a new confession, the Confession of 67, declaring that Christ the Logos was the Word of God to whom the Scriptures bear witness. That's a tremendous and fundamental shift in the theology of the church. The Presbyterian Church was one of the first to appoint women elders and women ministers. And then, of course, in Jackson, Tennessee, as we know, as we did everywhere, we went through the Civil Rights Movement. And the First Presbyterian Church in Jackson had one member who was a doctor who was the first to integrate his waiting rooms, and to see the first to do that. We also had a member in the 1960s who ran for the Democratic nomination to the United States Senate so that somebody from Tennessee could go up there and put an end to this civil rights nonsense. Have those two members, same church, same time. And got over 200,000 votes, by the way. Didn't beat Estes Kefauver, but he got 200,000 votes. So what do? You're all under the same roof. First Presbyterian is now entering its 3rd century. John White is the pastor, and he's been our pastor since 1983. This congregation lives in a world of denominational fragmentation, as we're seeing with the Methodist Church, Global Methodist, United Methodist. The largest churches in this town are now independent churches. Independent churches are the largest churches. There's a fragmentation and a fraying and a corrosion of the denominational structure. Aware of its history, the First Presbyterian Church carries a commitment to provide people an opportunity to confront the life-changing presence of Christ in a world that sees secular and religious conflicts continually. First Presbyterian has these stately grounds. Organ of that church costs over $1 million. Dedicated people built that and donated that. There are a lot of people that come along and look at that and say, that is absolutely, totally ridiculous and unnecessary. Give me a keyboard and a Vox amp and a shopping center, and I can have a church, and you can have a church anywhere. And so it's a tremendous load that the Presbyterian Church carries financially. The First Presbyterian, with its stately grounds and its longevity, still seeks to be a place of reflection and commitment above the fray, where anyone is welcome as we try to work through the personal and reflective challenges of this life. There are storms in this life, storms in this community, and in the Presbyterian Church history, there have been storms inside the church among members. It still tries to be an oasis, a refuge, a call to serve. It continues to have a place, it believes, in Jackson, Tennessee, and moves into its 3rd century. And that's kind of an overview of the First Presbyterian Church.